Welcome back to Sharing Sox. We are here with a guy who is much smarter than me, Alan Nathan, and a guy who is a little less smart than me, my father, the geezer. Just kidding. He's also significantly smarter than me. You'll notice I've done a little costume change. I did a play at Steppenwolf Theater in Chicago years ago, in which I played a South Bostonian. And they dressed me with a Red Sox hat, so I'm sporting that here in my solid anti-Yankee solidarity with Alan. And again, thank you so much for being here. The first half of our conversation about substances really, really insightful. It's stuff I really wish I knew back when I was a pitcher for all those years. And really, as a hitter as well, it would have been nice to know which way the ball was going to go when I saw it leave the hand. So maybe Alan's got a future here as a manager for his beloved Red Sox. But Dad, if you want to steer us in a slightly different direction for some more baseball science, take it away.
Yeah, initially, when I first contacted Alan and we first communicated, we were going to talk about before this sticky stuff matter stuck to us. We're going to talk about the baseball itself. We know that the major league's desperate for offense, juiced up the baseball. We know that they horribly overdid it, and routine fly balls are ending up in the 14th row. And we know that they tried to bring it back some and may or may not have succeeded. They had a committee to study all this. Were you on the committee, that they used? Yeah. Good. So what did you talk about what the committee found and what the result of that was?
Sure. So one of the things that, I think the primary thing that we found that was initially, I would say, very unexpected was the primary reason for the increase in home runs. So this is what the committee was charged with finding. What is the reason for the increase in home runs, which began roughly at the All-Star break in the 2015 season, and with the exception of 2018, where there was a dip, they've been more or less going up ever since. And the primary reason we found had to do with the air resistance on the ball. So there is a property of the baseball called the drag coefficient, which sort of controls how much air resistance there is on the ball. And it's affected by various things, but I think primarily it's affected by the seams of the ball. So the seams, it was found through very careful studies in laboratory experiments that several things were found. First of all, you take two virtually identical baseballs, they look the same, they feel the same, and you measure their drag coefficient. So the higher the drag coefficient, the less carry on the ball. The lower the drag coefficient, the more carry on the ball. You measure their drag coefficient in a laboratory setting where you have total control over everything, and you find that they're different. They're not different by a huge amount, but they're different by an amount that could affect the distance on a sort of a long fly ball by, maybe 5 to 10 feet. That's big, okay? That's the difference between a warning track shot and a home run. So through a lot of modeling, so through a combination of laboratory experiments, analysis of StatCast data from Major League Baseball, and then some physicsy type modeling that you have to do, we were able to convince ourselves that it really was the drag coefficient that was the primary reason for the increase in home runs. And the reason why that was surprising was that no one ever really thought to look at the drag coefficient. It's not something that is routinely measured by Rawlings, the company that manufactures the baseball, or by Major League Baseball. They contract with various independent labs to measure properties of the baseball, the weight of the ball, and they dissect the ball and do all kinds of measurements. But this was not one of them, because no one ever thought that this was all that important. Well, it turns out it is important. Moreover, its control, it probably largely has to do with the seams of the ball. So one of the really neat things that I got to do being on this committee was visit the manufacturing facility for the baseballs, which is in Costa Rica. So we had a whirlwind trip to Costa Rica, an all-day tour of the place, and I learned a lot about how baseballs are made. And I came away incredibly impressed with how careful everything is done. As a matter of fact, I am amazed that, you compare one baseball to another baseball. I'm amazed that they're as uniform as they are, okay, with the exception of the drag coefficient, but all other properties, the weight of the ball, the size of the ball, how hard it is to compress the ball, the bounciness of the ball, those are very, very well under control. But most of that is done by a machine. The winding of the wool is all done by a machine, very carefully prescribed how they do it. But the very last step is sewing the leather cover onto the ball, and that's all done by hand. There's a room full of maybe 200 people. I took a neat little video of this, that are spending all day long sewing. This is the motion of their arms. They sewing the cotton threads, that bind together the leather onto the thing that's primarily wool. And despite everyone's best effort, it's very hard to get these things sort of the same from one ball to another. You could imagine that it's difficult, given that it's done by hand. And so we concluded that the huge variation that you see from one ball to another, or not huge, but there's substantial variation that really does affect the flight of the ball, is almost unavoidable, given the way that balls are made. And
could you have it done by machine?
So one thing you could do is I don't think you could have this done by machine. This would be pretty complicated. I don't know. I'm not an engineer, so I wouldn't even know how to begin thinking about how to do this by machine. But you can imagine having some sort of solid molded ball. You've probably seen these batting cage balls that are. I think they're made out of rubber or something. I'm not really sure.
I think so. Yeah.
But it's a one-piece ball. It's not as if there's stuff. There's an outer cover or anything like that. You could imagine building those things uniformly. So one of the really interesting things that we also got to do was we visited the United States Golf Association facility, which is in northern New Jersey, where they do all kinds of testing on golf clubs and golf balls. And in particular, they measure drag coefficients for golf balls. And they do it maybe differently than was done for our committee, but they're more or less equivalent. It's not a difference in accuracy or anything. One of the things you find is that when you take two golf balls that are from the same manufacturer, same dimple configuration and everything, you measure their drag coefficient, they're bang on the money. They're perfectly agree with each other, which is very, very different than what you find for a baseball. But a golf ball is sort of a molded thing, right? You can create some mold that makes these things virtually identical. You simply can't do that with a baseball. So I'm going to push back just a little bit on something you said, Leigh. I don't think, my own personal view, and I'm not really a spokesperson for Major League Baseball, but again, my own view, having seen the process sort of firsthand, I don't think there has been any effort on the part of Major League Baseball or Rawlings to either juice the ball or de-juice the ball, with the exception of a change that they actually made this year and announced the change where they decreased the weight by a little bit and changed the bounciness by a little bit. But prior to this year, the variation you see from year to year and from one ball to another within a given year that's the way they came out. And I personally am persuaded that really, it's not some nefarious conspiracy among different people to change the game by doing that. Again, this ball-to-ball variation, the interesting thing we found was that within a given season, the ball-to-ball variation in this drag property was greater, probably significantly greater than the variation in the average drag property from one year to the next. And given that we don't have any great understanding about how to control that ball-to-ball variation within a given year, it's a much harder to control the much smaller change from one year to the other that leads to quite different offensive statistics, such as home runs.
So it's a batter, whether a batter comes up and becomes a hero with his home run, or a GOAT making the final out deep in center field, could be just the luck of what baseball he happens to draw?
I'm afraid that's the case. Yeah.
Wow.
There's a lot of luck, but again, there's a lot of luck in baseball. So for example, the wind could be blowing out for one batter, but not for another batter, or there are variations from one ballpark to another. There are variations from one pitcher to another. So look, baseball is, I'm not going to say primarily a game of luck, but most certainly there's a lot of luck involved. I mean, the best team doesn't always win, for example.
Within the rules, the regulations of what a baseball is, there's kind of a big range for something in $1 billion business. That is 9 to 9.25 inches, I think, for the circumference, and 5 to 5.25 ounces.
Yes.
Did you, that's like 5% on the weight? That seems pretty random. Did you find that it's really not that they're really more consistent than that?
Yes, that's exactly what we learned. We learned that the specs, I don't know why they're as wide as they are. And our committee definitely recommended that they be tightened to reflect reality. Reality is that they are much more uniform than is allowed by the specs. And one of the things that's that you didn't mention that's also uniform is the so-called coefficient of restitution, the so-called bounciness of the ball. That's much harder to get right because you don't know what it is until you test it. It's easy to measure the weight as you go along in the construction process, easy to measure the diameter. And each step along the way, they're measuring these things. They have targets, for the different layers of wool. But the COR, the coefficient of restitution, you don't know that until it's all done. Nevertheless, they are very, very adept at controlling that to a much greater degree than the actual specification allows.
What about these humidor things? Is that going to be an impact as they spread through more stadiums?
I believe so. One of the things that Major League Baseball has been doing now for several years is they are requiring the clubs to monitor the storage temperature and relative humidity from where the balls are stored virtually on a daily basis. So and we know very well from laboratory experiments how two major properties of the ball depend on the humidity in which they're stored. One is this coefficient of restitution, the bounciness, and the other is the weight of the ball. When the ball absorbs water, it gets heavier. When it's dry, it gets lighter. And if you look at the variation across a major league season, so from, say from mid-March until, late October, the variation, at a particular ballpark and in the relative humidity where the ball is stored, it's varying in a systematic way. When it's usually dry in the early spring and dry in the fall and humid in between. That affects the properties of the ball in a not insignificant way. So one way to control for that is by storing balls in a humidor. And So now I believe there are 8 major league clubs this year. I think it's 8, I could be wrong, for which the balls are stored at constant temperature, constant relative humidity. And that certainly will even out the seasonal effects. And ultimately, to the extent that every major league club does this, will even out effects, from one ballpark to another. So I think that was one of our recommendations actually of our committee, is that they start storing, that they monitor the storage environmental conditions and looking towards the future, which we're in now, using a humidor.
Can I ask one just for other people who might be interested as well? We know that in Colorado we've got thinner air. The ball is a little more likely to travel. You're talking about the humidity, the amount of water the ball absorbs. When they're playing a game in the middle of July in St. Louis and you're looking at 88% humidity, 97-degree temperatures, how is that going to affect the ball as compared to, let's say, Phoenix when it's 105 but 30% humidity?
Okay, so there are 2 separate things, 2 separate ways of attacking your question here, and you have to distinguish between them. There is the temperature and humidity of the storage location, and then there is the temperature and humidity of day of game. And the reason why those 2 things are different, or why they matter differently, is that it actually takes the baseball a long time, like days, before after being in a certain environment, before it assumes the properties of that environment. So if the ball is stored in a humidor and then it's brought out the day of the game, and it happens to be very humid, at much higher humidity that day, the effect of the humidity, the storage humidity on that baseball hasn't really changed, because it takes days to do it. Now, having said that, temperature and humidity does affect the flight of the ball, independent of how the ball is stored. Humidity, actually not so much. Relative humidity does not play, it's all has to do with air density. So the air is less dense as the temperature is higher. It's less dense at elevation, at Denver. And it's actually a little bit less dense when it's humid, but that's not a big effect. So relative humidity is not a big effect on the flight of the ball. It is, the temperature is a big effect. So the ball will carry much better on a hot day than it will on a cold day. And players know that. They even adjust.
I think we've used up so much of your time, which we really appreciate, but I want to give you the chance now, lifelong fan, even of the wrong team, and thorough expert on physics and baseball, to say, and we had enough chance to converse a little, to say the 3 of us all agree we want baseball games where you hit the ball in the field and people run around and people try to catch it, instead of, oh, there he goes again, or guys dragging their bats back to the dugout. What would you do if you're Ron, you're the commissioner, you're God? But what would you do to get baseball as best you could back to a more exciting form?
Yeah, look, I'm no more expert than anyone else is, but my pet thing that I would do is I would eliminate the shift. I would insist that there be 2 fielders on each side of second base, and that no one is playing on the outfield grass. And that's what I would do. And I think that I think that would end up changing batter behavior in such a way that they would not be so enamored with trying to hit a home run. That's what I hope. But
I think we're all still figuring it out. We've certainly talked about eliminating the shift on this podcast before. We've even talked about, not letting guys leave the batter's box, not letting pitchers recoup as long in between pitches, potentially leading to more base hits, more balls in play. But I think the number one thing we've discovered is that we really have no clue exactly what is going to get us back.
People have, some people have suggested shrinking the strike zone a little bit, maybe vertically shrinking it. You can't change the size of home plate very easily, but you could shrink the strike zone. I don't know. People have talked about moving the pitching rubber back a foot or 2 feet.
Make any difference from a physics point of view?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it gives,
it's 1/100th of a second or something.
Yeah, it takes maybe 0.4 of a second, 0.4 to 0.5 seconds for the pitch to from release to home plate, and you change. 1 foot is roughly 2% of the distance, so you're increasing the time by 2%. Seems like a small effect, but I think it actually could play a big role. But that seems somehow, I can't bring myself to like that idea.
I totally agree.
Last time this problem existed, big time, 1968. The solution that Major League Baseball tried and succeeded with was to lower the mound from 15 inches to 10. Can you lower it more without creating other big problems? Could that be something?
Yeah, probably. I mean, from a physics point of view, there would be some obvious effects. From a biomechanics point of view, I think pitchers would certainly have to learn how to live with that different situation. I don't know how long it took them. That was a big change after the 68 season. I mean, going from 15 to 10 inches is huge. And I don't know how long it took the pitchers to adjust to that. Maybe not long at all, I don't know. But that's something that it seems to me, someone should experiment with. One of the things that I think MLB is trying to do is experiment with different things in the minor leagues, where the things don't, the penalty for messing up is not quite as great. And for a while they were using independent minor leagues, rather than affiliated leagues. But I'm not sure exactly what they're doing this year. But there's a number of things I thought they were going to try, and I don't know where they are on that.
Yeah, I believe they are experimenting with
The 1
with
foot.
a mound that's a little further back and with a mound that's a little lower. I'm not sure exactly which leagues they're doing that in.
What about with the baseball itself? Would you recommend any changes in weight, in circumference, in seams higher, or and this is to combine, because you got the conflict between making it harder to hit home runs and making it harder to strike people out. You got to do both of those at the same time.
Relevant to the current sticky substance thing, in Japanese baseball, they actually treat the leather coating with some substance that provides a uniformly sticky feel to the ball. And I think that MLB should give very serious consideration to doing something similar. Number one, it obviates the need to mud the ball. You don't have to mud it because it's already, and they don't in Japanese baseball. There's no need to do it. They don't have any Delaware River, apparently. And it probably is a solution to this issue of not being able to get a good grip on the ball. So I think I know that MLB experimented with that during spring training maybe a couple of years ago, and I don't know whether the pitchers didn't like it or did like it, or I suspect they probably didn't like it, and that's probably why they haven't started to implement. But I think that would be a great thing to do. And the second thing I think would be good to do is for Rawlings to it's several things. One is measure drag coefficients. They don't measure them. Okay, they're measured by independent labs, but Rawlings could measure them for every batch of baseballs. drag coefficients can be measured non-destructively. So they could do that, and they should, and maybe they need to monitor that now that we know how important it is. The other thing that I always thought was very important to do was to keep track of the manufacturing cycle for each baseball. So you have a box of baseball in the storage bin, at Yankee Stadium. There ought to be something on there on the box that tells you with some code so that you can trace back and figure out when in the manufacturing cycle these were manufactured. In case it turns out that these balls turn out to be anomalous, at least we can try to track it down to figure out whether something funny happened during the manufacturing cycle. If you take the ball apart, on the inside of the leather, there is a stamp on it that identifies the manufacturing lot, but you don't want to have to take the ball apart. We'd like to be able to, and so that was one of the other things that we recommended, our committee recommended to MLB, but as far as I know, it has not been implemented yet. It ought to be, though.
Well, I'm really looking forward to the near future when we've got a lot of this science down, and we're talking about Tim Anderson's batting average on balls in play against a certain drag coefficient and baseball restitution, and
Right.
we're just slamming players because they suck against bouncy baseballs, but they're great against non-bouncy baseballs. Because let's be real, when we can have more stats in baseball, we're gonna have more stats.
That's what we need.
That's our thing. But I think we're gonna wrap up for today. Alan, thank you so much for coming on. I learned a lot.
I'm glad. It's definitely my pleasure talking with you guys about this.
Yeah, Geezer, do you have any last thoughts?
Well, I just want to, for those who might have stopped in the middle here, mention that our guest has been Dr. Alan Nathan, Professor Emeritus of Physics at the University of Illinois. And I'm going to say it, the world's foremost expert on the physics of baseball. And a Red Sox fan, but nothing can be done about that at this point. So, we'll hope our two teams meet in the playoffs this year, and ours beats yours.
Okay. I hope to be in Chicago sometime in September when the Red Sox play the White Sox.
Hey, you should check it out. This is the first time in a while. It's been really fun to go to a game on the South Side. So I hope you do make it out, and you're always welcome to hit us up, and we could try to catch a game with you. But yes, thank you so much. This has been a real treat. Listeners, thank you for tuning in today, and we will catch you next time on Sharing Sox.